Hello and welcome to Portals to the Past. I'm your host, Will Hickox of the Watkins Museum of History. Portals to the Past is a series of interviews with historical figures significant to the border region. This series is a partnership between Humanities Kansas, Freedom's Frontier and National Heritage Area, and the Watkins Museum of History. We are recording this on a very special day, the 100th anniversary of the official ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, granting women the right to vote. And through a miracle of technology, we are able to travel back in time and interview an actual suffragist, Lawrence resident Genevieve Howland Chalkley. We'll start off with an introduction by Mrs. Chalkley, followed by some questions. And we encourage you, the audience members, to get involved by posting questions for our guest in the Q&A feature. Please use only the Q&A feature and not the chat feature. We may not have time to address all questions, but we'll do our best. Hello, Mrs. Chalkley, and what an honor it is to meet you. I wonder if you could start off by giving us a little of your personal history and how you got involved in women's suffrage.
Thank you, Mr. Hickox, and welcome everyone. I was born Constance Genevieve Howland on August 12, 1875 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but I always went by Genevieve. When I was 6 years old, my family and I moved to Lawrence, Kansas in 1881, when my father, Reverend Clark G. Howland, became the minister of the Unitarian Church. My mother, Marcia Brown Howland, graduated from Antioch College, a very progressive coeducational school, and her sister, my aunt, Reverend Olympia Brown, was the first woman ordained with full denominational authority in the U.S. in 1863. She lectured extensively during the 1867 Kansas Campaign for Women's Suffrage and told such stories about traveling by horse and wagon across the state and giving over 300 speeches. My older sister, Marcella, and I attended the Unitarian Sunday School taught by Professor Frances Schlegel Carruth, who advocated for women's suffrage with her husband, William H. Carruth. When I was but 11 years old, Kansas became the first state to grant women the right to vote in municipal elections on February 15, 1887, the 67th birthday of Susan B. Anthony. So we celebrated both events. The following day, Annie Diggs, a very vocal suffragist and temperance worker, became the first Lawrence woman to register to vote, despite male opposition at the city clerk's office. To prepare for the April elections, Mrs. Carruth urged all women to register with Sarah Brown, who co-authored a statewide leaflet, What Women Voters Can Do, with Professor William Carruth. Miss Brown had been the first woman nominated for a state office in 1880, that of State Superintendent for Public Instruction. On Election Day, I watched Black women vote for the first time with such jubilation with my mother. So you see, I was raised and educated by very progressive suffragists who believed in equal rights for all women. After graduating from high school in 1893, I remember the 1894 Kansas campaign, meeting Miss Anthony at Mrs. Carruth's home, attending suffrage club meetings in the community room of Watkins Bank, and reading the Suffrage Advocate newspaper published in Lawrence. We felt so disappointed when the constitutional amendment for full suffrage was defeated by over half of male voters. But Sherman A. Harvey, a Black KU graduate, was reelected district court clerk for a second term by a much larger majority, and he selected Carrie Langston as his new deputy. As you may know, Miss Langston later became the mother of the esteemed Harlem poet Langston Hughes in 1902. I attended KU, played tennis, and graduated in 1897. 3 years later, I married Thomas H. Chalkley. Having been born in England, he represented British creditors of the Watkins Land Mortgage Company at Watkins Bank. In addition to his 2 children, Harold and Ethel, from a previous marriage, I raised our 2 daughters, Marcella and Hilda, at our home on 1121 Ohio Street. When Marcella was 2 years old, I joined the Lawrence Equal Suffrage Association, chaired by Sarah Brown. I remember meetings with Dr. Lucy Hobbs Taylor, a staunch Republican and the first woman dentist in the US, who told us her struggles to obtain her dentistry degree. Mina Perky Dias, an 1896 KU law graduate, explained the effects of Colorado suffrage after 1893. Oh, we felt ever so proud when Mrs. Roxana Rice became president of the Kansas Equal Suffrage Association for 2 terms from 1905 to 1907. During this time, I raised funds for managing a women's public restroom downtown for shoppers and invited my Aunt Olympia to speak in Lawrence again. In 1909, I was elected first vice president of the Kansas Equal Suffrage Association and subsequently organized counties in the Second Congressional District during the 1911-12 campaign. In February 1911, Lizzie Sheldon, a staunch Democrat and KU law graduate, wrote the legislative resolution for a constitutional amendment that read, "The rights of citizens of the state of Kansas to vote and hold offices shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. Both male and female citizens of this state shall equally enjoy all civil, political, and religious rights and privileges." Mrs. Sheldon was quite determined. She became the first woman to run for a Kansas Supreme Court seat in 1914. But unfortunately she lost. In March 1911, I hosted British suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst at my residence. Her mother, Emmeline, organized the UK movement. Miss Pankhurst advised KU ladies to take a law course and emphasized that we must unite women of all socioeconomic classes, for men had failed to recognize the wretched conditions of struggling factory women. I heartily concurred. I also agreed with Helen Grenfeld from Colorado that the widespread indifference of privileged club women posed a greater formidable obstacle than converting male voters. So we tried new campaign strategies. We held suffrage teas at private upper crust homes in each ward and edited a special suffrage edition of the Lawrence Journal World. When asked why I believe in equal suffrage, I said, "It is a foregone conclusion that every Kansas mother and woman taxpayer appreciates her rights to vote on municipal affairs, and it is impossible that any Kansas man would say we are any the less womanly for doing so. There is a saying that we cannot make water run uphill, for we cannot change the laws of nature. Woman will always be the homemaker, and as such, it is necessary she should know about and have a vote in the securing of pure food. Nothing concerns her more vitally than this domestic problem, and the weapon to cope with this situation is the ballot, which is her due at the hands of Kansas men." Professor Alberta Corbin arranged for Jane Addams to speak about her settlement work at Chicago's Hull House at the redesigned Bowersock Theater. We sat on the stage spellbound with 50 other dignitaries. Mary Cowper staged How the Vote Was Won, a popular comic British one-act play with local talent at the Woodland Park Auditorium in August and the Bowersock Theater in October. For the Kansas Douglas County Fair in September, my daughter Marcella rode in Mr. Perkins' automobile with other ladies for a grand suffrage parade all over town. You can see this photograph at Watkins. And Clara Colby, an extraordinary national and international speaker, addressed crowds from an automobile parked at 9th and Mass Street, and also reminded our Unitarian church members of our spiritual duties toward less fortunate women. From Lawrence and Topeka, Mrs. Stella Stubbs influenced her husband, Governor Walter R. Stubbs, a great deal throughout this campaign. After we won universal suffrage in 1912, by a narrow margin of 52%, mind you, I was elected state president of the renamed Good Citizenship League in 1913 at the Jubilee Convention held in Lawrence. We resolved to promote woman and child welfare, to fight for a minimum wage and an 8-hour workday, to secure pensions for widows, and to assist suffrage campaigns in other states. Over the next 10 years, I worked tirelessly for child welfare and women's labor as an officer or member of the Federation of Women's Clubs, the Kansas Council of Women, and the Women's Kansas Day Club. Governor Walter R. Stubbs appointed me to the Board of Control of State Charitable Institutions in 1912, and Governor Arthur Capper appointed me to the Kansas Industrial Welfare Commission in 1916. During the Great War, I made bandages, raised funds for Liberty Bonds, and recruited student nurses as vice chair of the Kansas branch of the Council of National Defense. As a delegate to state Republican conventions, I campaigned for presidential nominee Charles Evan Hughes in 1916 and met Senator Warren G. Harding in Marion, Ohio, before he became U.S. president. In Lawrence, I served the community through the Civic League, the Civic Studies Club, Friends in Council, the Association of Collegiate Alumni, and as a trustee for the Unitarian Church with its associated Alliance of Unitary Women and Society. In 1919, I ran for, but lost a position on the Lawrence School Board and conducted a child welfare survey in the 2nd Ward for the state the following year. Aunt Olympia and Helen E. Sterrett, another Lawrence activist, were the only 2 survivors from the first woman suffrage conventions in 1869 to attend the 1920 National Convention in Chicago. They celebrated what would have been Susan B. Anthony's 100th birthday in grand style. My 9th great-grandfather, John Howland, came to America on the Mayflower. So, based on my colonial heritage, I joined the Kansas Colonial Dames, the Kansas Society of Mayflower Descendants, and the Betty Washington chapter of the Daughters of an American Revolution in Lawrence. In September 1921, I became the first president of the Douglas County League of Women Voters for only 5 months, because I wanted my daughters to broaden their educational horizons in England for 2 years. I returned to the United States in 1924 and later lived in New York City. I died at a convalescent home on Long Island in 1965 at age 89. You can visit me at Oak Hill Cemetery in Lawrence, where I'm buried with my parents, sister, and husband. Thank you so much.
Wow, what an amazingly active life you've led, Mrs. Chalkley. That is truly inspiring, I think, to all of your viewers right now. And we will, I do want to get back into more of your personal history in a little while, but first I have some broader questions. Number one being, why do you think Kansas is such an important state in the woman suffrage campaign?
Well, few people know that Kansas was the first state in the nation to fight for a constitutional amendment for woman suffrage as well as for African American suffrage in 1867. And as I stated, we were also the first state in the Union to fight for, to earn and gain the right to vote in municipal elections in 1887. And Susan B. Anthony always said that Lawrence was the headquarters of the Kansas movement for women's rights. So Kansas is still a very important state.
That's excellent. Well, These next two questions, I'm very excited to say, come from some of your descendants that we've been in contact with. One question is, did anyone recruit you to the suffrage cause, or did you take it up on your own?
Well, as I said, I was raised by suffrage parents, so and had Francis Schlegel Caruth and William Caruth as dear friends through the Unitarian Church. So I just naturally fell into it. I did want to wait a little while for my eldest daughter, Marcella, to grow up. So I didn't join the Lawrence Association until 1904. And from then it was just constant suffrage work. And I was so thrilled to be elected a vice president for the Kansas Equal Suffrage Association. And then, of course, to become the first president of the Douglas County League of Women Voters, which lives on today.
That's right. And the next question is, asks to dig a little bit more. Folks are interested in the mechanics of the suffrage movement and how people get involved. And who were some of your mentors? You mentioned a lot of people who you partnered with in the movement, but who were your mentors in fostering your activism in general, perhaps not just with the suffrage cause?
Well, again, all of my teachers, and I had many friends and colleagues at the University of Kansas. Mina Perky-Dias and I were were college students at the same time. Roxana Rice was incredible. She had been involved in the Unitarian Church since 1880. And so it was really a wide variety of people. It's hard for me to say any one person. Certainly my Aunt Olympia Brown was a very, very strong mentor for me in many ways. And she became very involved in the Wisconsin women's suffrage movement there.
Interesting. So did technological and communication advancements play a role in the women's suffrage campaign in any way?
Well, as you know, it was we communicated primarily by writing through the U.S. Post Office, which was so crucial to our movement. In addition to that, we had the telegraph and we had newspapers so that we could publicize our meetings and our work and events that were happening across the state. And of course, from the beginning, we traveled in carriages. And then, of course, the railroad, which was incredibly important. And for the 1912 campaign, of course, automobiles became much more important and useful. More and more people had automobiles, and so that we could travel not only around town, but also across the entire state for our campaign. So all of that technology was quite important to the cause.
That's very interesting. And it may interest you to know, Mrs. Chalkley, that technology is still very important to modern political campaigns and activist causes. However, vehicles are still very important, and the U.S. Postal Service is still vitally important as well.
Oh, that's good to know.
Indeed. We have some questions from viewers now. This question comes from Anne, and she mentioned, well, you mentioned, I should say, Mrs. Chalkley, that you said that one activist was a staunch Republican, and a little bit later on, you mentioned that another partner of yours in the movement was a staunch Democrat. And Anne is wondering, was support for women's suffrage divided along party lines?
It shifted just as the two main political parties shifted over time. As you know, the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. And so many women from the beginning joined the Republican Party for its abolitionist causes, as well as for temperance, because temperance was a very important issue, especially in 1881 when Kansas became a prohibition state under Governor St. John. The Democratic Party came along later and by 1912, that's when the Democratic Party became far more important, when President Woodrow Wilson was elected to the U.S. as U.S. president. So then the party politics began shifting between the Republicans and the Democrats. And the Democrats, continued to gain a bit more power. The Republicans were still pretty strong. And I'm still not sure exactly what happened since that time. There were always lots of partisan politics between those two parties.
That's true. That's true. Speaking of partisanship and opposition, we have another question from an audience member. Who were your strongest opponents and what were their objections to women's suffrage?
Well, politicians, of course, because that's where the power lay in the Kansas state legislature, as well as the governorship. That's why we were so thrilled when Governor Stubbs from Lawrence, Kansas, was elected for 2 terms, and he gave us much hope. But unfortunately, he was not always a woman's suffrage supporter. He had been on the fence since serving as a Kansas representative before he became the governor of Kansas. So that's why we owe a great deal of debt to his wife, Stella Stubbs. So there was always opposition on all sides of the aisle. And it's hard to say, the major opponents. Again, we also had a great deal of women who felt that women did not need to vote because their husbands voted for them, which is an argument that's difficult for folks such as myself to fully comprehend. But there were a lot of women who agreed with men that if women voted, they would become tainted by male partisan politics.
Well, another question we have is, Catherine would like to know, well, first she mentions your letter to the editor in which you mention pure food. Could you elaborate on that phrase and the significance of it?
Well, we had been living with tainted food for decades, and tainted meat and so forth. And so it wasn't until many years later that the Federal Food and Drug Administration was created to regulate all kinds of food. And this meant a great deal to us. And in the I believe it was around 1920, 21, 22, is when we began to have new milk ordinances to ensure that milk was fully pasteurized and healthy for our children and indeed all people to drink. So food has been such a central part of women's homes. And that's why I just felt so strongly that we needed far more laws that would regulate the health, the safety of our food for all people, not only in Kansas, but across the country.
Well, that is a great segue into another question from a viewer. Grant would like to know, what progressive legislation were you involved in supporting? And did Kansas help lead the nation on some of these issues?
Well, one of my pet projects had to do with children. Because I was very devoted to my 2 lovely daughters. And around the 1920, or I think it was in 1917, is when Kansas began to address child labor laws, which was a huge issue, not only in Kansas, but across the country, because young children under the age of 14 or 16 were working in mines and in factories and hard labor in agriculture alongside their parents and so many other industries. In fact, they even stopped child actors from performing here in Lawrence because it was considered child labor. I was also greatly concerned about women laborers who labored in factories. And that's why I was very involved, especially after hearing Miss Pankhurst speak about factory women in Britain. I was so concerned that they should get a minimum wage for their work and that those factories should be inspected regularly to make sure that those conditions are safe for women and indeed all people to work. So those were my 2 main issues, and I can't necessarily speak to the other issues in terms of the United States. As you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt established quite a few New Deal ideas and legislation to help workers throughout the entire Great Depression. So Kansas, of course, was wrapped up in those exact same issues at the time.
Excellent. Here's a question from Latanya. She would like to know, how did you help Afro-American women to vote? How did you get the word out to African-American women?
Well, I recall in 1887, when we won the municipal vote, that my mother helped many African-American women who were illiterate by helping them to read their ballots and to make sure that they could check off, which vote that they preferred for whatever issue. So that was wonderful. And I also remember hearing, again, many rallies for that convention, for that, before the April election. There was Louisa Bell Carr, was this young high school student who delivered her graduation speech on women's suffrage. We were so proud of her. And in the 1890s, that's when another generation of African-American women became very much more active because they had earned degrees at the University of Kansas. And they also joined the Progressive Literary Club, which was one of the first and best literary clubs devoted to African Americans. And I recall Lucy Woodruff and Lavinia Davis or Paralee Davis, Lavinia Hawkins, so many other incredible women who were, and Mamie Dillard, of course, in addition to Carrie Langston, who were all working on behalf of women's rights. And Miss Dillard also worked for the Women's Christian Temperance Union to help help that cause quite a bit. And as many of you may know, Miss Dillard went on to teach Carrie's son, Langston Hughes, at Pinckney School, not to mention serving as the longtime principal at Lincoln School in North Lawrence.
Very interesting. You mentioned the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and we have a question from Lori. She's interested in learning more about the connection between these movements. How was the temperance movement aligned with the women's suffrage movement?
Well, they were deeply intertwined because the Women's Christian Temperance Union arose from this horrible problem of men drinking so much liquor that they would devastate their families. There was much domestic abuse against wives and children. The men were so drunk they couldn't hold down a job, which of course devastated families of all kinds. So it was such a crucial issue, and that's why so many women, such as Annie Diggs, were members of both equal suffrage associations as well as WCTU associations to fight for all of these causes that directly related to women's homes and families.
Now, I do want to get into some of your later activism, but we have a fun question here from Carolyn. She's struck by the sash that you're wearing. Did each state have their own differently designed sash?
Most of our every state sort of came up with similar or different sashes. As you know, the thing that's important to remember is that Susan B. Anthony chose gold back in 1867 to represent Kansas sunflowers. And that color stayed through even into the Alice Paul's Women's Party in the early 1920s. And white has always been used as a symbol of women's purity. Throughout the 19th century, women were always considered to be, shall we say, the more moral or ethical group of people that needed to control, if you will, or persuade men's dispositions and behaviors at home. And I don't recall, I believe the purple came about as a symbol of loyalty to all women and children.
Interesting. Now, Mrs. Chalkley, How did your fight for equal rights change after the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920?
Well, a woman's work is never done. So again, I was away in England for a couple of years from 1922 to 24 with my daughters. I kept reading the news from the United States to find out what was going on. And as I say, child labor was a large issue, and minimum wage for women laborers. Lots of issues, came to the forefront. And I'm pretty sure it must be a lot like today, where people care deeply about current events and issues that are going on. So, the Great Depression was horrific, but we did what we could to make sure that unemployed people could have food and clothing and shelter of some kind. And then, of course, the World War II, which was a complete shock, was devastating as well. And many of us, tried victory gardens and, of course, sold victory bonds, much like we had done in World War I with Liberty bonds.
Excellent. Now, let's see if we have any more questions here. Here's an interesting one. Did you have any interaction with Susanna Salter, the first woman mayor, who famously was the mayor of Argonia, Kansas, and also, of course, Lucy Sullivan, just down the road from us, was active in Baldwin City. Did you have any interactions with some of these early women politicians?
I knew about Susanna Salter and, of course, Lucy Sullivan, but I don't recall exactly if and when we met. I was so, I truly can't remember exactly if we had interactions. I'm sure we must have attended many of the same, I must have attended some meetings with Lucy Sullivan through the Douglas County Suffrage Organization. But there were so many women involved. We had over 100 women in the 1890s involved in the movement. So it's easy for individual women to get lost in the crowd, I'm afraid.
Well, we don't blame you at all, considering the large roster of fellow activists that you've worked with over the years. It's quite an impressive collection of friends and fellow activists that you've assembled. We have, I don't know, I don't want to scare you, Mrs. Chalkley, but it would probably interest you to know, and we've alluded to this a little bit, that 100 years hence from the passage of the amendment in the year 2020, we're still struggling in the United States with some of the issues that you and your fellow female activists were dealing with in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I wonder if you have any advice or suggestions for women today who are struggling with issues of inequality, like unequal pay for doing the same work as men.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about that. I would have thought that more issues would have been straightened out. Women have long deserved equal pay for equal work. I can't get over the fact that truly it's still a problem. Well, all I can say is we found that it was best to create separate, segregated women's organizations. We felt that was the best way that we could push legislation as separate groups, because it's always been so difficult to get men to recognize that women's issues are people issues. It doesn't matter what sex you are. All these issues affect everyone across the entire country. But women have long felt the need to create those separate organizations. So I would hope that there might be some separate women's organizations today that might be affecting some sort of change on this whole variety of issues that affects all of us.
That's wonderful. Yes. Well, thank you for that, Mrs. Chalkley. And again, I would just like to reiterate what an honor it is to for you to step aside from your what I'm sure is a very busy schedule and talk to us today. Now, I would like to transition to the second part of our program, which is in which I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Jen Klein. And as you just saw, she's engaging in our tradition with Portals to the Past and the previous events in the series of doffing the hat, which, you know, takes her back into her everyday persona of Jen Klein. Now, I'd like to introduce you, Jen, and ask you to step out of character, which you've kindly done. Could you speak a bit about yourself and how you discovered the story of Genevieve Howland Chalkley?
Well, back in January of last year, Sarah Bell actually reminded me that 2020 was the centennial of the 19th Amendment. So of course I thought, well, I must simply, you know, begin some research and write something about this major event in the lives of so many women. So the more I read, the more I discovered the extraordinary history within Kansas and in particular Lawrence. So I wrote a booklet, an essay that Sarah has created as a booklet called Women's Suffrage in Lawrence, 1854 to 1920. And I was just amazed, the number of women and all that they did throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And I might add that I'm currently in the process of continuing that history by writing a history of the local Lawrence and Douglas County League of Women Voters that will elaborate on the founding in 1921 and can summarize from then on to perhaps 2020 or 2021 for the next centennial.
That's fantastic. I'm excited to hear that you're preparing another booklet. And you mentioned the League of Women Voters. Can people today still get involved in that organization or any other organizations to help out with issues like voting rights? And does it matter? Do you have to be a certain age to be involved in that group or any other group?
No, not at all. The League of Women Voters, I want to stress, anyone can become a member of the League of Women Voters, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or national, regardless of gender, okay? So we have quite a few male members who are active in our local league, as well as Kansas and the nation. But again, it is still woman-led. So we often go out to the high schools and encourage high school students to register to vote as soon as they turn 18. Personally, I'd like to see that change to age 16 because they're more than ready and knowledgeable to vote at that age. And again, plenty of activities. So League of Women Voters remains a nonpartisan organization. So we are not affiliated with any particular political party. So people of all political parties, whatever your political persuasions, are encouraged to join the League and to participate in getting people to vote.
That's wonderful. So vital in this day and age. How can people, we had a question that I didn't get to in the first part of the interview, but another question from Latanya. And perhaps this will give you a chance to elaborate on some of these sources and sources of information that folks can turn to. Where can we learn more about women's equal rights and the suffrage movement?
Oh, well, if you've noticed recently, there's been a deluge of information online. There have been lots of webinars, lots of presentations, exhibits, meetings, all sorts of activities. It's quite easy to find any information at all about the suffrage movement. Quite a few professors have written books. So there's a lot of books out there that are just fantastic that will give you details. For this year, there's been an extra push to highlight women of color who were very involved in women's equal rights throughout the 19th as well as the 20th century. So I would encourage you to just start searching, start reading, continue reading, and get involved. There's quite a few ways that everyone can participate and make sure that we have a safe and effective election in November.
Wonderful. So, Jen, I would like to wrap up by thanking you for being involved in Portals to the Past and for giving this wonderful presentation today about a figure who is not well known outside of suffrage historian circles probably, but should be, I think, just based on her activity alone and her energy in the cause, should be much more widely known. So we thank you for bringing to light this story of Genevieve Howland Chalkley. And thanks to you for your own activism in this movement and for help to highlight these stories of past activists. I'd like to just reiterate, you saw it on the screen and we mentioned it, that Jen's booklet, Women's Suffrage in Kansas, in Lawrence, 1854 to 1920, is available at the Watkins Museum of History. We also encourage you to check out a new website that was put together by staff of the Watkins and staff of other historical societies in Douglas County. It's titled Explore Douglas County Women's Suffrage, and it has a lot more details about this cause here on the ground level in Douglas County. And I just want to wrap up by thanking everyone for being involved today, by posting your excellent questions, and another big thanks to Jen, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.